My name is Victoria, and today I'm replacing Brian because he's traveling in Czech Republic, and at the moment he's having some technical difficulties with the internet connection. So a bit about me. A few Add1Challengers can know me. I've been working for Brian for the past 6 months, and today, if someone doesn't know about Add1Challenge, Add1Challenge is all about language learners around the world who are supporting each other and motivating each other to hold a 15-minute conversation in 90 days. And today, we are very happy to have Mike Campbell, the founder of Glossika, who can speak in Russian, German, Italian, Taiwanese, and Mandarin perfectly. And thank you, Mike. Hi. So, do you want to tell a bit about yourself?
All right. Well, I haven't really prepared anything, exactly what we're going to discuss today. But I'm available to answer any of your questions. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the first questions will be from the live audience. Who wants to be first? Anyone?
Yeah, I'll go first. Hi, Mike.
Hi.
I'm a big fan. I bought one of your products, bought your Glossika product for French, and I was just curious. You have one video where you said you don't usually recommend using your product for learning a language from scratch, but you tried it yourself and you had some very interesting results. I forget what language it was. I was just curious what your stance was on that since then, since much more time has passed. If you really feel like your method is useful for learning a language from zero.
Well, okay. May I ask what's your name?
Kevin. Sorry.
Kevin.
Morehouse.
Oh, okay, Kevin. Okay. Because I probably might remember your name if you're a Glossika buyer. So okay, so the question is really about how to begin a language from just a blank slate, from absolutely no knowledge. And I think that this really has to do with your experience. For myself, if I hear a foreign language that I've never studied and that I've never, I know nothing about, the grammar or vocabulary or anything, it's unrelated to a language that I already know. The thing is that when I hear the language, I hear all of the words very clearly. And that's going to be very different than most people. And the reason for that is because I understand sound systems, I understand the mechanics of all of the different sounds. There's more than 100 different sounds that our mouth can make, and I'm familiar with most of them. And I'm familiar with producing the sounds and hearing the sounds, so I hear details different than other people. So the thing is that if you're an absolute beginner, you need to start with identifying and recognizing the sounds. So if I'm learning a new language, I think it takes some time for that language to actually start feeling very fluent in comprehension in my ears. There's like one day where everything just seems to click into place and you just hear it very clearly. And I've gotten to the point where almost every language sounds clear in my ears. Like you could actually say something in a different language and I might be able to repeat it on pretty closely when I first hear it. And I think that's just because of years and years and years of experience hearing lots and lots of very different languages and also getting to know the sound system. So I would assume that most people, they're not at that point. It's going to take a long time for them to achieve that. And so I would say you have to really focus a lot on the sounds. And the thing about writing systems is that what I like to call is a lossy format. It's like in computing. If you transfer a high quality sound file or picture file to another format, maybe it's an MP3 or maybe it's you know, a JPG or something, and it's very low quality. What you get is a lossy format. So the data is encoded there, but there's just less information. And that's exactly how writing is in most of the world's languages. In fact, writing is a shortcut for recording all of the sounds of a language. For example, in some languages, like in Korean, they have one letter that will represent both R and L, and the R will appear, the R's, and they're in complementary distribution, which means that only one or the other sound can appear at any one time. So one will appear at the end of a word or at the end of a syllable, the other appear between vowels. And so to them, they only, since that is complementary, then they really don't need two different letters. To them, it's one and the same sound. But for foreigners that have both R and L, would think that that's kind of strange. Why would you have one letter representing two sounds? And so we have to understand that every language that we learn, there's going to be one letter that represents many sounds in different situations. And so in phonology, that's called allophones. And so we have to learn what those allophones are. So if you're learning, for example, maybe Victoria can give us a few examples from Russian. But I mean, if you're learning Russian and you come across the word to do something well, as in well,
Хорошо.
you're going to have a word with 3 O's, but every single O is pronounced differently because of the accent. So the accent is on the last syllable. Listen to Victoria one more time.
Хорошо.
So you start off with ha, sho. So the first vowel is going to be the second vowel will be and the last vowel will be o, and o is the accented O. So in Russian, хорошо, the O's are appearing in different locations in the word, and so they take on a completely different way of pronunciation. Now, to a Russian, they never need to think about it. It just makes complete sense, because if I say каждого in Russian, which means of everyone, the O's at the end of the word are now schwa sounds. They're And so to a Russian, they don't need to think about it. They would never say каждого. That would sound very strange to them. But if you're learning for the first time and you don't know that and you say it like that, well, the Russians, they're really not going to understand. You'll also find that people learning, for example, American English, they don't understand that T, the letter T, has, they might always say better, they might say lighten, but in the word lighten, we normally use a glottal stop, so it would become lighten. For better, we use a flap, so it becomes better. And we don't have a separate letter in the alphabet for the flap or for the glottal stop. And so some foreigners, maybe if they're coming from Arabic or another language, they will think, well, that's strange. Why would English speakers not have a separate letter for the glottal stop like we do, or for the flap like we do? That doesn't make sense. But to an English speaker, we just use T for all of those sounds, and that makes perfect sense to us because they're in distribution. Like only one or the other sound can happen in any situation. I hope that makes sense. I know that your question is starting from scratch, but I think that this idea of writing being a lossy format from speech is a really, really important thing. So writing, what we call it in linguistics, is phonemic. And so phonemic means it's just the least amount of material needed to represent the sounds of the language. And then phonetic has a lot more detail. So when we publish our books, like this is for studying Korean, you're going to find several lines of data in there. And one of those lines is going to be the IPA, or International Phonetic Alphabet, and we write it phonetically so that there's more data showing all of the allophones and differences there. So once you're able to identify all of these sounds that exist in the language and how they relate to the writing system, then you're able to not only comprehend better. My first goal with language is not really speaking. It's how much can I learn to comprehend and listen in on conversations or watch TV or news. To me, that's one of the most important things, because if I'm comprehending and I'm starting to understand, I can start, maybe creating my own sentences eventually. So And I think that fluency can apply in both ways. Like you can really hear somebody at a fluent level where everything just flows very easily and you're able to comprehend it at normal speed. And I think that should be one of the first goals you try to reach for. The problem with some language learning methods, if you're learning just by visual, for example, Duolingo, or I think Duolingo is adding some sound component now, but Memrise I think is also adding some sound components. But these kind of memorization systems, they're mostly text-based, and I'm really kind of scared that people will be learning a lot of languages from them, but they really need to see everything in order to learn. And I think your languages will really take off when you get away from the text and you're able to process the sounds. We as humans, we're very good at processing sounds and we're very good at audio. So because that is how language developed for thousands of years, millennia ago, for every individual we have to relearn how to do that, because we were taught from the age of 5 and 6 going to school, everything is in a book and written down. And we need to retrain ourselves how to learn things orally. And most of the languages in the world are not written down. They're oral languages, and they still have complex grammar and lots of vocabulary, but everybody remembers it orally. So this is a really important thing that we need to educate people on, is to come back to that. Okay, so if you're starting a language from scratch, the first thing that I would do is I would want to know, what is the word order of the sentence? What do the verbs look like? What do the adjectives look like? If I can identify those parts of speech, I don't need to remember all of the endings of words. And if you're learning a language like Turkish or Finnish or Hungarian, then you need to know that the ending of words are the equivalent of prepositions in English. So you'll have fewer words than English, but what should be a preposition will actually show up at the end of words. And so that kind of makes it a little bit easier, because you really only have those forms. Whereas in Russian, it can be very difficult because you have both prepositions and ending of words, and then those endings change depending on the preposition's meaning. And it'll also change depending on the sound inside of the word as well. So if the word originally ends in a, maybe you'll have a different ending, maybe oi. And if it ends in a consonant, it will become an and so you will have all of these different endings just based on the sound in the word. And Turkish and Finnish, they go with vowel harmony in the word. So the endings will normally just harmonize with the other part of the word. So it's a little bit less data. As long as you identify what is happening in that language, what word do you start with? You start with a verb or the subject? That's probably the most common kinds. And then are you going to have the object next or the verb next? And then, is the verb go at the end of the sentence? So Mandarin and German are very similar, because you will have subject, verb, object, and then you can also put a verb at the end of the sentence after the object. So this is very common in Mandarin as well, and in German. But in Korean and Japanese, the verb is always at the end of the sentence. So it's like Latin. And so if you're starting from zero, I would say that I can take any one of our courses and I can start it basically with no knowledge of that language. All I need to know is maybe the information from the introduction. What kind of a language is it? What phonetics does it have? And then I can really start working on it, going through everything and learning it from the sound files. So for me, there's probably less startup time required. I'm just worried that your average learner, they're probably really scared about learning languages, intimidated by it, and they're not sure about what they need to do. And I think that most people just need to relax, because even for me, I'm going to have a lot of data that I don't understand when I'm learning the language. And the most important thing is to go through and just recognize the parts of speech, not the meanings of words. If you get the parts of speech right, the meanings of words will come. And you'll be understanding the sentence where the stress comes in the sentence. Today somebody was here in our office recording Swahili all day long. And I was listening to Arabic in my office all day long. So I was comparing English and Arabic, and I could hear the stress, even if I don't understand all the words, but I could identify where the verbs and the nouns are because of the stress patterns in the sentence. So I'm just checking for quality to make sure that our sentences are actually lined up correctly. So because I don't understand everything, all I'm looking for are the keywords and for the intonational patterns that they match and that these sentences are for sure saying the same thing. And it's actually easier than you think.
Okay, Mike, thank you very much for your answer. So now we will move on to the questions from the Add1Challenge subscribers, and a lot of people are asking about your Mandarin accent. So how do you speak Mandarin so well? What is your approach to mastering the accent?
Okay, with Mandarin, well, yeah, okay, so Mandarin really has an issue because of the tones, and I think that people tend to think that tones belong to some sort of other group of languages completely different than my language, and I would argue that that's not true. For example, if you ever watch American television, you will see people on TV, they will have these conversational filler words in the sentences, and they will say something like, duh. Mm-hmm. Okay, now if I ask you, what does duh mean? Duh. Does that sound like nonsense? But if I say duh, does that make sense? Or what if I change the tone and I say duh? Does that make sense? So if I say the word duh with 4 different tones, like in Mandarin, duh, 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 which one of those sounds like the American duh, duh? Would you say
Can you
number
say
3?
them again?
Okay, so duh, 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 duh. Which one sounds like the way Americans say it?
The third one.
The third one. The third one sounds. Now you can identify it out of the list of words that I said because one fits into the tonal pattern that you're used to hearing, right?
Yeah.
This is exactly the same with Mandarin, is that when the tonal pattern of that word fits with what you're used to hearing, then we recognize it. So Americans have it too. Americans apply these tones onto all of their words. So the tones are placed over a sentence, usually over the sentence pattern, not individual words. But I can say something like present and present, and there's going to be a different tonal pattern on that as well, and you will hear different meanings. So what I tend to believe is that all languages are tonal, and that Mandarin tones are actually easier than English tones, American tones, because I've done some research on the American tones. There's more than a dozen tones used in American English. For example, if I start a sentence, I went to the store today. My tone is going up. I went, and then the next tone is went. I would say the tone is like lower. So I went to the store today. And the last word, today, is a very low falling tone. So I went. So there's actually I've counted I think 4 or 5 different rising tones in American English, and most Americans would never even realize this, and it's quite interesting. So Americans just don't think of it in terms of tone. And likewise, you can think that China has thousands of dialects. I mean, there's probably about 200 dialects, but out of all those dialects, nobody really knows the tones that they're saying. We have one standard language, which is Mandarin, and then you have all these other dialects. But yet, if you speak the dialect with that right tonal pattern, people will understand you. And if your tones are wrong, they won't understand you. The thing about it is that nobody knows what the tones really are, unless you're a linguist and you're analyzing it. But the average person, they couldn't tell you what it is. So coming back to the English, if I say duh, 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 only the word "duh" sounds like the word that Americans say, because Americans always say it in the same tone. And you can recognize that immediately. So if I'm saying, if I ask an American, what is the tone for the word "duh"? Why do you always say "duh" and you don't say "duh"? Americans wouldn't be able to answer the question. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Thank you, Mike.
When Chinese children go to school at the age of 6 or 7, they go to school and they have to learn what the tones are, and they even have homework assignments in their books, like write the tone number for this word. And of course they get a lot of them wrong because they're not really sure that the words that they're saying, that they know how to say regularly, they have to learn what they are and the tones. And so they do about a year of that, or 2 years, and then they kind of know how to apply the tones to any word. It becomes systematic. But it doesn't change the way people speak. So if I take a Chinese sentence and I just say it, according to the tones in the book, it's going to be completely different than the way people actually speak the language. Why is that? It goes back to what I was saying. Lossy format. Taking a language and just taking it down to a simple 4-tone format is actually deleting a lot of the data that people are using when they speak. So the question that you asked me is, how can you reach a very fluent, a great fluency in Chinese? You actually have to figure out how to take the lossy format of 4 tones and turn it into a really full and robust way of speaking. Okay, so I have here a sentence from the book. What did he do when the phone rang? Okay, so this sentence is basically one action is interrupting another action. Well, in this case, there isn't a continuous. It's one action happening and then another action happening, and we're asking what that person did with the other action. So when you're learning a new language, you want to be able to recognize what kind of a sentence this is. We have 2 past tenses. The English sentence reorders the words, so he did what when the phone rang, or you could say the phone rings at the time. At the time that the phone rang, he did what? If you want to rearrange it back into an original word order. So in normal English speaking, we would say, what did he do when the phone rang? So think about how many different ways you can say that sentence in the way it would be expressed in other languages. The phone rang. At the time that the phone rang, the man did what? You can try to rearrange the sentence in many different ways so that you can start to pick up on the syntax of other languages. So in Chinese, it's 电话响时他做了什么? Okay, so telephone ring time, he did what? And so the verb has been changed to past tense here. So, but it's not changed to past tense when we say the phone rang, because when I say the phone rang, I add the word when, and when indicates. See, in English, when you use the word when, your verb is always in the past tense. When you use the word after and before, the verb is almost always in the past tense. After I got to work, after he came home, before I got to work, or before I came home, when I got home, when I arrived, the verb is always in the past tense. You would not say, when I was arriving home. It sounds a little bit strange when you do that. So the thing is about English is that these verb tenses, they usually line up exactly. And so when that is redundant, in Chinese, you don't need verb tenses because a lot of that data is redundant. So when I say here that 电话响时他做了什么? Okay, so if I say this exactly as the tones are written in the book, 电话响时他做了什么? Then I sound robotic. I sound completely like a robot. But when I say the sentence again, now this is sentence number 703 from our Glossika series, but if I say it in a very fluent way, 电话响时他做了什么? The tones of the sentence are blending in from word to word. So you go from a very choppy, pronunciation system, and then you smooth everything out to make it flow, right? And so that flow is what the fluency is. So it's impossible to actually take that flow and write it down in a book, because writing is a lossy format. You're going to lose a lot of data. But if we could show that flow, if you look on a computer screen and you can see the flow of the tones, you will see that they're not exactly as the book says, flat and falling. So you have to find how to make everything flow together. And so the best way to do that is when you hear Mandarin speakers speaking that you're able to mimic. You basically need to identify, okay, I know those words, I should know what the tones are, or at least I can identify what they're saying, the tones are. And then you have to practice saying it. So this sentence right here, I just randomly opened to another page. They don't have any children. So here I see a tone, tone 3 and tone 2. And so this reminds me of the word for America, which is also tone 3 and tone 2. In the beginning, I think I always said it wrong. I would say something like 美国, but that's wrong because it should be 美国. So the first tone 3 should just be really low, 美国. And so this one, 他们没有小孩. So 小孩. Now if I say it robotically, just as the book says, 他们没有小孩, it sounds, I don't know, it sounds kind of ridiculous, but 他们没有小孩. If I say it like I'm talking normally, 他们没有小孩, 他们没有小孩, then I'm just speaking normally. Okay, 我现在就是讲得很正常的样子. So I'm just speaking normally. Я разговариваю нормально. Just speak normally. Okay, so. All right.
Thank
so.
you very much, Mike. That was very interesting to listen to you. We have Helen joining us. Do you have any questions, Helen, to Mike?
I was just interested in the fact that, if I understand it correctly, the Glossika sentences are the same in every language. Is that true? And if so, why are those particular sentences chosen?
All right. Okay. So if you take a look at the description for the 3 books that we have, we tell you what is actually in the book. So we could, of course, use different sentences, but I think that we're leaving that for the user to use the pattern to create more sentences. So once you feel the pattern, then you should be able to create more sentences. Of course, if you're learning a language like Russian, then it will be difficult because we're not covering so much vocabulary that you can catch all of the patterns of the grammar. Because Russian will have a lot more patterns than the words that are actually presented in the books. But from the very beginning, what you get are the adjectives. And there are 2 kinds of adjectives. The adjectives that are in predicate position. For example, he is old. This is new. This is usually after the be verb. And in Russian, you have 2 kinds of adjectives. You have an adjective with a short form, and so the short form is only really going to, it doesn't have a long ending. It just has a really short ending. And so you can use this kind of, well, actually, the short form adjectives in Russian, it's really best to just practice with real sentences. So I don't want to state like absolute rules for this. But in Russian, there are the short form adjectives and long form adjectives, and it has a relation to this with the predicate. So if I say starый человек, then I'm saying old man, but I'm using starый и and then человек to describe the man. Старая what can I say for something else? Started much, no, I would want to say. Okay, so starая машина would mean an old car. So you can hear staraya, and starый. So you get different word endings depending on where the adjective is used. And so the sentences are presented in the beginning, so you're getting the predicate adjective and then the adjective in front of nouns. So when the adjective is in front of a noun, it's going to change. Now, in some languages, it's behind the noun, right? Like in Vietnamese and in Spanish and French. And so Spanish, French, and Italian, they have sometimes the adjective before the noun, sometimes after the noun. So you have to learn it by occurrence. And you just need to pay attention to how those endings apply with the with the nouns. Now the thing is, with European languages, you have masculine, feminine, and neuter nouns. Most people try to think about all of the words in European languages as having gender. Like, does this thing, a table, does it really act and feel like a man? But this is not really the right way to think about it, because I think if you go back hundreds and hundreds of years, in every culture there have been teachers that teach children the correct grammar of their language. And so if you think about it in this sense, well, the teachers, they want to come up with an easy way to describe it, and they would say, well, if the word has this kind of sound at the end, we're going to call it a boy or masculine. And the children just learn it like that because it's easier and it's fun. Okay, so if it has an ah sound at the end of the word, then we're going to call it a girl. And look, you know, even a girl has the sound, and even žena, a woman, has the sound. So it's easier, you know. In so many languages of Europe, ah represents the female form, and so it really doesn't have much to do with gender. It really has to do with the sounds of the word. So if I'm learning a new language, it could be Icelandic, or it could be Bulgarian, or it could be Greek, or anything. What I'm going to look for are the sound patterns in the ends of the word. So if I know that, for example, the a becomes an e in French, so there's a slight change. It also becomes an e in German. So a lot of the words ending in e in German and French are also going to be called feminine, but that's just a label so that you know how to call it. You know what to call it, so you can apply other rules to it. So I wouldn't think of it in terms of gender or sex. It's really just how to manipulate the endings of the word and apply your grammar correctly. So I've seen lots and lots of discussion online about this argument in particular, and I think it's people, they try to argue it too much. Sorry, what was your question?
I was just wondering why those particular sentences, which I can see, they seem to build up in difficulty, and so I'm wondering at the end of the course, because I've only seen what we've had from the Add1Challenge. I've not seen your materials before.
All right.
Can you give an example of, I'm doing French, so towards the end of your course, how do they progress in difficulty, the sentences? Can you give an example of what they might progress to? It doesn't have to be French, it could be some other European language that I might understand a bit.
I actually have that description. I think it's directly on the website. I don't know it off the top of my head, but to answer your question, I mean, generally speaking, in book 1, the first 1,000 sentences will cover, like I said, the adjectives first, and then some action verbs, and then these action verbs, how to express it in the past and in the future. I think it's mostly habit versus past tense. So things that you often do versus things that you have done or planning to do. So are the stores open today? You probably have these sentences because it's in the sample book that we sent out. But then later on, he doesn't usually drive to work. He usually walks. And so in the first book, what we get are, you know, this idea of usually driving to work and usually walks. In a language like Russian, you have to be very careful because the motion verbs, or verbs of going and coming, there's a lot of different kinds of verbs, and then you get a lot of prepositions that are added onto the words. So this is a kind of a really good thing in the syntax to compare and contrast. Now, French may not make all of those distinctions, but it's important to know how to express those distinctions in French as well, so that you're understood. So if you're going to use a verb like usually, an adverb like usually, and then use the verb, like in English we say usually drive, there's no change to the verb, it's just the present tense. Then that's that's an important thing that we need to learn how to express. And that all of that is covered in the first book. So the first book will cover the present tense, the past tense, the habits, and so on. And then when we go on to the second book, I think the first book we also cover the difference between continuous and what we call perfective or perfected verbs. So in Spanish and in French, Italian, you have something called imperfect. In Slavic languages, you have imperfective, and it kind of means the same thing. In English, we would call it I am doing, I was doing. It's a continuous action that is not finished, so it's imperfect. And in French, you will also have perfect, which is something that you have done, this, for example, this month. So you will usually have a time period. In all of our sentences, we usually pair a verb tense with an adverb. So what have you done this month will have a perfective verb plus a time period. What have you finished this year? Or I have taken 3 courses this year. So you have this time period, and then you have the verb that actually matches that time period. You have to remember, we're translating the sentences into many, many languages, and you can't just translate something very simple like, I have done it, because our translators won't know how to translate it without more information. And the thing is that when you take it down to such a small level, most people, they don't really know what you're trying to express. And so if you have a complete idea with a time period and adverb and the action, subject and object, then it's really, really easy to express what you're trying to say. And what I've done is I've tried to use sentences that are very common in everyday speech and everyday conversation that would be touching on the most frequent vocabulary and expressions that we would want to use when we're speaking to other people for the first time using the language. So there's a lot of sentences in our books 2 and 3, in books 1 and 2, I'm sorry, that cover about what you're planning to do this weekend, or what I did last week, or what I'm doing next week, just your daily activities. There's something about a story about a woman that she had to go to a meeting in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and then she had to fly to Venezuela, and then she went somewhere else, and at the end of her trip she was very tired, and she got back home. And so, you know, just little stories like this about where she went, what she did, how much time it took, and simple things like that. What did you do in the morning? What did you do in the afternoon? What did you do in the evening? What are you doing next Saturday? And so a lot of these have to do with activities and times. And that's basically the core of the Glossika course in the first 2 books is times and actions. And you're getting an idea of how to express all of your actions paired with the time. Okay, and then when we get to the second book, starting at the beginning of the second book are passive and active. So the passive and active is you're just switching, you're using the object now that received an action. So you see somebody get hurt, but we can say, for example, I just said got hurt, right? So got hurt is actually the what we call the spoken form passive in English. The correct form would be to have been hurt. We use the be verb plus the past participle. So I was bitten, or I was bit by a dog. But most people would say it in speaking, I got bit by a dog. They would change it to the got verb. This is just the difference between speaking and written form. So in the beginning of for example, this is book 2 for French. There was a fire at the hotel last week. Il y a eu un incendie à l'hôtel la semaine dernière. 2 of the rooms were damaged. 2 des chambres ont été endommagées. So, ont été, they received this action, endommagé, damaged, or endamaged, as the French say. So you can get the sense of how the structure is put out in French. And then once you understand, you know, what the sentences are saying, you basically close the book and practice saying it after the native speaker, so you can refine your accent, and it gets flowing easier and easier. I would say try not to reference the text too much. I can't find my keys. I think they've been stolen. Je ne trouve pas mes clés. Je crois qu'elles ont été volées. And so it's interesting. They have been ont été volées. To me, it sounds like they have flown away or something, because vol sounds like the word to fly. I don't know for sure, but this is how my brain works. I will take a word and connect it with something that I already know, and then I would think of the act of being stolen with this idea of just fleeting, flying away, and so that would be a way that I would remember it in the future. So my keys were stolen last week is the next sentence. Mes clés ont été volées la semaine dernière. So it's combined with a time word here, and that's really important because when we express ourselves using the time together with the verb tenses, it really helps reinforce the way you speak the language.
Thank you very much, Mike.
If you want me to go through a list, I can tell you what the second book and third book cover, because I have a list in front of me right here. The second book will go through future actions, modal verbs, commands, existentials, indirect speech, causatives, like I had him do something, or I wanted him to go do something, and then also verbals, like the difference between gerunds and infinitives. And then, you know, in languages like Russian, you have adverbials that take on different forms as well. And so I've tried to, because I have kind of a general knowledge of many languages, I try to think of what's happening in different languages, and we'll put in an example sentence in there that will at least show you what's happening in all these different languages. So in book 3, we do more work with the modals, and then we do a lot of work with prepositional phrases. So the phrasal verbs of English get a lot of coverage in book 3. Prepositions are probably one of the most difficult things of all European languages, because several years ago I studied Icelandic for about a half year, and I found the most difficult thing with Icelandic is probably the most difficult thing in English. It's this phrasal verb, like if you say to take up something, or to take over something, or to, you know, all of these different prepositions added to the verb change the meanings completely. And that's kind of not just Germanic, but Latin and Slavic languages, they all do it. But the place of the preposition is different. In Latin and French, Spanish, Italian, you get the, you'll get the let's take com, for example, or co. So you'll have it added onto the word at the beginning. So if you have relate, you have co, and then add an R, so it blends together. You get correlate. So to come, and then let's see, communicate, you get communicate. And so in the Germanic languages, you'll also have this preposition at the beginning of a word, but then it detaches like in English, and it goes after. And so you can get that detachment starting a new phrase, a new prepositional phrase. And in Slavic languages, it doesn't matter if it's Polish or Czech or Russian or Serbian, it's the same thing. For example, in Polish, odwiedzić, you would have like od, which means out, or you can say dowiedzić, and then do means towards, and that's attached to the verb. And then also in Russian, you have more prepositions after the verb that take on another case ending. So prepositions are really hard. And so we do a little bit of practice before book 3, but we do a lot more in book 3 on that. And then, of course, we do, what else is on that list? Conjunctions. Yeah, that pretty much covers, and book 3 has a lot more of expression, for example, explaining a situation that you see. Okay, so for example here, I didn't bring enough cash, so could I pay by credit card? And so the idea is that in English, the word credit card is actually a countable noun, but whenever a word follows the word by, it cannot be countable anymore. It drops the S. For example, I'm going by car, or I'm going by bus. Normally you can never say the word car or bus without an or something like that. But in English, this is how the grammar works. And so if I say paid by credit card, all of a sudden that word just becomes uncountable like this. And then if I'm learning, for example, the French, je n'ai pas apporté assez d'argent, not enough money, so alors pourrais-je, so may I, or can I, could I, pourrais-je payer par carte de crédit? So you have the word par. So I know in Spanish you have para and por. You have two different words for like for and by, and they don't exactly line up directly with English. And so you have to learn them by situation. When do you use the para and when do you use pour? Para and pour. And in French you have this word pour and pas. I think they pretty line up. They line up pretty well between French and Spanish, but not with English. And prepositions in German are really difficult because they have completely different meanings than what you would normally expect. For example, in German, you would say, for example, ich gehe nach Hause. Nach means after, but in this sentence it means towards. I'm going towards home. I'm going home. But they would use the preposition after. So ich gehe nach Hause. This nach means after. That's just how the preposition is used. So you have to learn it. Every language uses the preposition differently. And the other funny thing about it is that in each language you have a different way of expressing there is and there are. If you ever meet a Chinese person, they probably like to start with their sentences with the word have. Primarily because in Chinese the word for saying there is or there are is have. So if I say there's a book on the table, a Chinese person would say have a book on the table, and a European would be confused. What do you mean have? Who has? Who has a book? But that's, in Chinese, using the word have without a subject indicates that something exists. It's the existential verb for something existing. In Russian, you can say yes, you could say вот, you could say, there's even a longer word that you could use meaning existing. How do you say it again? Является?
Является.
Является. Yeah, okay, является. So there's several different ways to do it depending on what you're trying to express. But so in Italian you would say c'è or ci sono for singular and plural. In Spanish you would say I. In German you say es gibt. It gives. You would say the word give in German to indicate something is here. Es gibt ein Buch auf dem Tisch. And so you see, every language has its own way of expressing. So you can't learn languages just by vocabulary if you don't have the context. If you look up any word in the English language, you're going to find maybe 5 to 20 different definitions for that one word. And so it's really painstaking to learn a word and memorize all these definitions and then the example sentences. But it's a lot more fun if you have situational dialogues where you just learn one definition for the most common way that people use it. Instead of trying to remember 20 definitions for that one word, you only have, maybe you have 20 situations and you have 20 different words very commonly used in those situations. And then you're communicating more quickly in that language than the person spending all their time memorizing tons of vocabulary that they won't be able to recall and use anyway. So I think it's really taking, it's taking a frequency, the frequency, putting it into context, training yourself to understand and communicate things in context.
Mm-hmm.
So, I can listen. I don't speak French hardly at all, but I can, just listening to the course, I can, like I just said, la semaine dernière, last week, la première fois, the first time, la prima volta in Italian. These kinds of phrases, they stick in your mind after you've listened to the files for weeks and weeks and weeks, just because they're set phrases that, they're just little chunks of the language that you can reuse over and over and over again. And they're quite easy to remember because it's not just a single vocabulary word. You can hear it popping up in all of these different sentences over and over again. So the spaced repetition builds and builds on itself as you go on. The parts are reusable. So always look for those reusable parts. Now, the thing is with vocabulary is once you reach a level of fluency where you're understanding and you're communicating on a basic level and you can get yourself to flow and now you can start expanding your vocabulary because you will have this thirst for more expression and you will be suffering because you won't know enough vocabulary. So I would say wait until you're thirsty for vocabulary before you start memorizing more vocabulary. Because when you start memorizing the vocabulary, it'll stick. You know, the one thing I like to say is that learning a language is like building a sponge in your brain. If I take water and I pour it into a sponge, that has no structure, that water is going to flow out, right? So if your brain has no structure for that language and you start putting in a lot of vocabulary, it's not going to stick. But if you already have a lot of structure for that language, then you can start adding vocabulary because you'll need it. You need to reuse it because you're using the language, or you're reading it, or you're listening to it. You need the vocabulary, and it's going to stick because it makes sense. It has context. And I think that people should delay vocabulary. You need to start with at least 100 or 200 words, you know, from the very beginning. But delay expanding your vocabulary. Expand your vocabulary through context only in the beginning, and then expand vocabulary as you need it. So I need this word, I'll look it up, I'll find it, I'll get it from my friend, and I'll use it. I'll ask my friend how to use it, and I'll use it. And then your vocabulary becomes alive, and all of that vocabulary works towards your fluency at the beginning. So fluency does not mean knowing the whole language. Fluency is the flow of sounds. Fluid, flowing, right? So you need flow. You need the flowing sounds. When you can process the language and flow the sounds out, you are fluent. Expression, this is why on all of our books we have this expression as the hardest level. We have more advanced books for, oh yes, here's one. So this is a business module for Chinese, and this is red. It has the red expression level. So the sentence in here are very difficult. It says, networking is one of the most vibrant ways you can grow your business and enter new markets. And we don't even put the IPA at this level anymore because it's an advanced level. But 经营人脉是让企业成长和切入新市场最活跃的方法之一. So you can practice these sentences at the expression level. They're very difficult, but you'll make a lot of progress in being able to use it at an advanced level. So I would say that, you know, your beginning fluency should really be focused on, you know, first comprehension, comprehending everything at normal speed, and then being able to say it. I think the most important thing is, are you able to replicate everything you hear that you comprehend? If I hear somebody say something, I understand it, can I say it exactly like they said it with the right sounds? I identify the sounds, I identify the words, and I can say them. Then your fluency is really coming. And also, can I write it down? Even if I don't, I just saw an article last week about spelling, and really, don't worry about spelling. And don't worry if you don't get the spelling rules of French, or, look, spelling in Chinese is ridiculous. You've got all of these thousands of strokes going in all of these different orders for each character. That does not represent the language. I mean, it represents the language in books, but it does not represent fluency. Okay, so yes, I can read and write Chinese, but it does not represent my ability to use the language in communication. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that writing and spelling and all of these websites that give you these flashcards and try to tell you to translate or memorize these words in writing, I really think that they are detrimental to actually building fluency, because it's building a visual form of the language in your mind and not an audio form of the language, which the written form of the word, since it is a lossy format, should just be a reminder for the audio. So if you've never heard the word, don't look at the word. You should do that later. I tell people to learn Chinese writing after they've learned how to say the words, because Chinese children, they learn Chinese writing very fast because they already speak the language. They see a word and they remember it because that looks like the word that they know that they speak. And so there's very little work. It's actually so easy to learn Chinese writing when you already speak the language. It's easy to learn the writing of any language once you already speak the language. And if you're not a native speaker, well, this is what our course does. It's supposed to build up that spoken and audio part of the training. Is supposed to give you that tool. so that you can now pick up the language. That's why all of our books really spend a lot of time on the pronunciation and the phonology with all of the IPA and everything. And like I talked about at the beginning, is a really important aspect. Making sure that you know the allophones and how, if you go from the written form, how it can create maybe 5 or 6 different sounds in the language. So, you know, we have to think about how we use our own language first. Like the letter T in English. You have the flap, you have a glottal stop. You also have, when I say stop, my T sounds like duh, duh. And this duh is exactly the same as most European languages for the letter T. Most European languages do not have t. So t and duh are 2 different kinds of T. P and b. When I say the word apple, I do not make a p sound. I say b. So apple, apple. I don't say apple, because then it sounds like I said the word app and then I said the word pull, and it sounds completely different. So in English, we have an allophone between the, this is what we call the aspiration, and then unaspirated, and then with the letter T, we also have the flap and the glottal stop. You know, there's just so many ways to pronounce this one letter. Like I said, letter is a flap, and I didn't say letter. So most foreigners learning English, they don't quite grasp the rules for that, and their teachers aren't able to describe it very well. But if you have our books, then it'll show all of that variation very clearly for every language.
Okay, Mike, thank you very much for your answers. Unfortunately, we went over time already.
Oh, we're over time?
Yeah, we're like talking almost for an hour now.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, it was very interesting to listen to you. So thank you everyone who participated in the broadcast. If you're interested in joining Add1Challenge, go to add1challenge.com. The new Add1Challenge will start in about a week, so subscribe and you'll get notified. Thank you, Mike, for an amazing broadcast. It was very interesting to getting to know you. Hopefully we'll do another one very soon. So thank you to all of you, and see you soon. Goodbye.
Bye.